Good afternoon everyone and welcome to the Governance, Audits and Standards Committee meeting. I'm Councillor Ian Holder, Chair of this committee. I'd like to draw your attention to the following. A few housekeeping bits. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble by the statue of Queen Victoria in Guildhall Square. In order to comply with the Guildhall Trust Fire Marshal regulations, if you are signed into the Guildhall, please remember to sign out when you leave the building after today's meeting. May I draw everyone's attention to the fact that this meeting will be live streamed. Can I please remind all attendees to turn their microphones on to speak and then off again once you're finished speaking. Members of the public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly that they do not wish to be recorded. Please be advised that the public seating area is not in view of the camera used to webcast this meeting. Please can I ask members and officers to introduce themselves, starting to my left.
Peter Bell, City Solicitor.
Councillor Russell Simpson.
Councillor Stuart Brown.
Councillor Graham Heaney, standing in for my colleague Councillor Smythe, who is away.
Councillor Susie Horton.
Councillor Spencer Gardner.
Richard Webb, Deputy Director of Finance.
James Harris, Senior Local Democracy Officer.
Thank you. And we have one apology for absence from Councillor Judith Smythe and Graham Heaney's deputising today. Declarations of interest, members. Do anyone have any declaration of interest? Councillor Brown.
Not a personal or prejudicial, but probably a professional declaration of interest relating to item 4. I am Chair of the Employment Committee.
Thank you. No one else? Thank you. In that case, we'll move on to item 3, minutes of the meeting held on 24th of November 2025. Richard's just noticed that names missing from the minutes. Richard Locke's missing, but the members happy to sign the minutes other than that? Yep. Thank you. In which case, item 4, update to Officer Employment Procedural Rules, Part 3D of the Council's Constitution. So Peter Balfe, the City Solicitor, is present to introduce the item.
Evening, colleagues. This is an item that comes before you to amend the existing constitution, to add into it essentially an ability to filter out frivolous and vexatious complaints relevant to chief officers. It's also been tidied up. And what James, and I have to give credit to James, who did quite a lot of the work, and we sat down and went through it. I've done is I've left in the additions in bold type, and I've crossed out bits I took out as a general edit. So you should be able to see in it on page 18 quite a lot of dark stuff, which is essentially an initial filtering panel that gives me as the monitoring officer an ability to cut out things that could be, for example, a grievance or a complaint that doesn't impact upon an employment position in terms of contracts or an implied term. Now that aligns with two things. One, what would be realistic in the sense of a complaint against a chief officer. And secondly, it aligns with the JNC Disciplinary Procedures Handbook, which needed to be augmented into our constitution. Now what I do say is it's quite a long tome as it is, and it still remains. It's always been this way, and it may or may not survive LGR and Devo in a few years' time. But what I have to say is it's worked pretty well, and we've not had to use it that often. It's a bit clunky, and I've seen better. The good news is, for the first time, we've got a filtering panel that does not mean that we have to initiate a disciplinary panel of sorts whenever we do anything. So it gives me an opportunity to weed out, dare I say, ill-motivated complaints against chief officers or officers of that level, or indeed the chief executive. And some of you may remember last year that we had issues relevant to how we dealt with a particular issue. And this is the net result of that process and the process management. It was put into train in July, and apologies for taking so long to get it drafted. It's entirely my fault. But I'm happy to tender it to you for consideration and adoption in the sense of it going off for agreement. Any questions?
Thank you. Members, any questions? No, it seems perfectly reasonable to bring it up to date.
So I bored you all to death with that one. That's good.
Thank you. Councillor Heaney?
I do have a couple of questions which don't relate to the bits that are there. as to why we appear to have a situation where the appointment of a chief officer can be objected to by a member of the cabinet who has had no part in any sort of presumably interview process or whatever, because it does say there that they can do that, and it just seems slightly bonkers. Because I can't see any rational reason why a member of the cabinet should, one, be given that, or have any reason to do it if they haven't been involved in the panel. But maybe that's something for another day.
Perhaps it is, Graham, but you know, there were lots of bits that were slightly odd, taken out and amended. I think the general idea is to give you as much exposure to the decision-making process as possible, in the sense that ultimately, if a panel of your good selves decide on X or Y appointment, it's extremely difficult for a malevolent member, for whatever reason, on a politicised basis, to say no. And I think that's the truth of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Just speaking as chair of the Employment Committee, I'm very grateful this is coming, because I think certainly Councillor Heaney was in the meeting with me when this became an issue, and it's good to know that we're bringing ourselves up to a bit more scratch with what's good practice by the JNC handbook.
Yeah, and also gives me a bit of coverage on the basis that whilst ordinarily we would have knocked that one out as of right, there was no process behind it. So actually it gives me a bit of coverage to say, look, I've made a rational decision based on it being frivolous or vexatious or an abusive process. Judicially review me if I'm wrong, rather than I just did it for expedience sake. And I think that gives us a sensible cover.
Thank you. So, members, it's recommended that the committee recommends to full council that it adopts the updated officer employment procedural rules at Appendix A to this report to replace the existing officer employment procedural rules at Part 3D of the Council's Constitution, and authorises the City Solicitor to make the above changes along with any other necessary minor consequential changes to the Council's Constitution resulting from the adoption of the updated officer employment procedural rules. Is the recommendation agreed, members? Thank you. Which brings us on to item 5. Report to Governance and Audits and Standards Committee on complaints received into alleged breaches of the Code of Conduct by members of the Council for the calendar year 2025. Peter Balfe, over to you.
Colleagues, this is my yearly report relevant to schools on the doors, relevant to member complaints and conduct. You can see it's a slightly weightier tome than my usual ones. And the reason I say that is because if you look at page 26, you'll see the number of complaints that I had to deal with in 22 was 4. 23 it was 3. 24 was 8, and 25 it was 56. So, you know, there's been a little bit of a cascade of fun coming to my door. And just to sort of give you a sort of bit of context, I've got 10 I haven't finished doing yet. I've got 5 to adjudicate upon, and I've got 8 that are awaiting IFP allocation. Now that's distinct from the numbers that I chuck out anyway, on the basis that I refuse to accept that they engage the codes per se. So these are all ones that were accepted, up and run and put. Now what I do add in context is a number of them relevant to individual parties. Figures were skewed by the number of complaints I had on the same issue, either as tranches of a group or over a period of time. So I do not say it is reflective of a sort of endemic problem beyond a certain thematic relationship between social media and complaint, which we'll come on to in a second. So I wouldn't get too exercised by the number. I get more exercised by the themes behind that number. Okay. Now, when comparing ourselves with, say, haven't, I had a look at theirs, and PSP ran off the figures for me. 22-23 they had 2, 23-24 they had 2, 24-25 they had 8, 25-26 they had 7. Now, of the increased, the causations were behaviours in formal council meetings and related to social media. So it's not necessarily just PCC at the moment. Now, I've laid out the scores on the doors for you, but I would also say that having done numerous filtering panels, as we all have to a greater or less extent in this room, we've all agreed that there are certain themes coming out of it. And the question was, what sort of powers does the MO have? We all know they are limited. What can or cannot be done? And I've set out for you what the LGA Code of Guidance relevant to a new Code of Conduct might look like. But I've also sensibly set out what the central government consultation is. And I have to say I'm quite pleased with the idea of what central government are considering consulting on as an augmentation to having no power to having a certain amount of power of sanction. Now, you all, as members, individually and as a group, have all said to me, what can we do, what can you do, and what can we recommend that you do? So I say to you that there are two things I can do. First of all, I can clear off the old lacuna about are you acting as a councillor when you are not a councillor. And frankly, I think that's almost getting to a point now where it's quite difficult to distinguish when you're not acting as a councillor, despite what you might say, and despite what your social media platforms might be. I think I need to clear that off to see what best practice is. That's the first thing. The second thing I need to do, I think, is for you to give me a steer about whether you want to deal with adoption of the LGA code as is, or you want to wait and feed into what central government's overlay might be. Because I think it's coming, because I think it needs to come, because of the nature of what you see in the media and the press about behaviours at meetings around the country. Okay. The other thing I add to you here is in paragraphs 3.13 and 3.14. I've alluded to the basic consequences of unchecked and untrammelled behaviour in an unintended consequence sense. I've laid it on with a trowel because I think you need to know, and I think it needs to be put in public forum, that I have set out in particularly paragraph 3.14 what the foreseeable consequences are of social media engagement beyond what would be normatively acceptable as an objective standard. And I think I'm right to do that, and I think all of you would agree with that. Right, so that's where we are. I say again, don't get too upset about the numbers, because we've had some thematically quite difficult things last year, and I had multiple complaints of various members purely on 2 or 3 incidents. So it's not as bad, but it all stems from social media context. So I'll leave it at that. Questions, please.
Councillor Simpson.
Would it be fair to say that whatever the government recommends will essentially be adopted by the new unitary after local government organisation? So if we do just wait for it, it probably makes more sense, considering that if we have a new unitary, we're going to have to adopt it anyway.
Councillor Simpson, I think that has to be right in the sense that we can sort of second guess what we'd like, but I still have no power until such time as central government gives me something that gives you teeth to direct me. You know, we're all alive to that, and you've all graciously and kindly given me a time to sit on the IFPs that we've had in the last year, basically since June. And it's been a busy time, but it's been good learning because you can see the themes coming out quite clearly.
Thank you. Members? Councillor Heaney.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I have a couple of questions about the figures and giving an understanding of where complaints are coming from, because what's interesting about the figures is they don't actually say whether complaints have come from members of the public or from members. And whilst I'm not suggesting that we need to, you know, the aggregate figure of number of complaints from the public would, I think, be a useful addition to the stats. The other thing we don't have is the number of complaints upheld. Again, and as an aggregate, you could say, you know, this is the number of complaints, this is the number of complaints upheld, would be a useful thing to have. So I'm just sort of wondering why they're not.
Councillor Heaney, what I say about that is you could have had the numbers I've upheld if I'd finished off the last 10 that I've got to do. So that I can probably give you a partial answer to that. I'll give it to you after when I've done the other 10. So far as member on member, it's actually not that many. What I'm tending to get is a cascade of the same complaint from 5 people that may or may not have the same causation, the same nuances in them. I accept them and treat them as a group, or if they're slightly different or completely different, I treat them individually. So I don't say, I reckon we've probably done about 5 or 6 member on member, 7 maybe, not that many, and I've refused quite a number, I have to say.
I think that was the one. I think it's interesting to know where the complaints are coming from, because if they're coming from the general public, I mean, am I able to make a comment on those there? I mean, I think sometimes, having sat on some additional filtering panels, whilst it'd be useful to know, then Commissioner, member of the public, sometimes members of the public make complaints on the basis that they just don't like what a council has either done or said, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's breaking the code. So they misunderstand that that is, that is the position. And again, in terms of you saying ones that are dismissed, that's obviously useful to know as well. So I think that could be a helpful thing. I mean, just to go back in history, which I tend to do, I do remember a stage when we did actually have sanctions against members. And I do remember an occasion when a member was, in fact, suspended, and then it was possible for someone to call a by-election and they lost their seat. Because I think that's an interesting thing that we need to think about in any response we make to a government proposal, because suspending someone because they have been engaged in misconduct might well be a reasonable sanction, because they then wouldn't presumably get paid either by their allowances. But I think we have to think carefully about whether that does open up the possibility that someone could be challenged for their seat, because, depending on the seriousness of the thing, it might be a sort of double punishment. You get suspended because you've done something a bit wrong. That's the sanction available. There wasn't that sanction before. So I think we have to think carefully about the circumstances, because in a sense it's almost a bit like recall, isn't it? Say once a council's done that, and I think there just needs to be clarity about whether the process does imply that you could lose your seat, because if that is set out fairly clearly, that might be a deterrent to some members to doing things they shouldn't do.
Logically, that's correct. If you have a period of suspension, you are denuding the electorate of meaningful engagement in the democratic process. Therefore, there must be a corollary to that, which would be potentially a by-election. Because, it's almost like saying you're incapacitated, therefore you can't. So I'm sort of with you on that, Graham.
Thank you. Members, any other questions, comments? Councillor Brown.
Peter, I know you said don't dwell on the numbers too much, but just quickly following on from Graham's question, obviously with 47 complaints across 42 councillors, it's quite clear not only do we have multiple complaints on the same topic, but multiple complaints about the same member. Now, I would never ask you, or member or members, in fact, because it could be multiple members. So I'm not asking you to name names. Is there any way we could get a breakdown of how many of 42? How many members make up the 47, or is that not something you would want to publish?
That's probably traceable in a sort of FOI type way. The best idea was paragraph 3.6, which deals with it party on party. Now, given that the numbers within a party, it's not particularly difficult to work out X and Y. What I do say, if you look at 3.6, is 18 and 17 and 24. If you take what the themes were behind them, there might have only been 3 generic complaints, but I had 6 and 8 and 5. And one of them, I had virtually 12 on just one incident, all relevant to one particular member. So that gives you a sort of context, which is why you say, for example, you've only got a couple for, not naming anybody, 2 for Labour, 1 for Independent, whatever, because they're not engaging that many as a group to complain to me in one cohort. So those figures for 18, 17 and 24 need to be looked at in the context of the number of causative complaints I had, which might be only 3 or 4, for example.
Thank you. Councillor Heaney.
There's just one minor point on the table on page on 3.6, in fact the second table. It says Reform UK and it says 22, 23, 23 and 24. Reform UK didn't have any representatives in 22, 23 or 24, so you might want to say NA, not applicable, because the group only formed last year.
Thank you. Members, any other comments, any questions? There are a couple of things that we were asked to consider in here. And 3.1, committee may also wish to consider annual remuneration for the independent persons and request a report to come back. I think that's quite a good idea. The independent person do some very good work. Does anyone have any objection to a report coming back?
Not an objection to a report, but are we looking at just the independent persons that volunteer on the filtering panels, or all independent persons that volunteer their time for the council currently? Because that would have a wider scope.
I have to think it's probably across the whole scope, all of them really, because getting volunteers beyond yourselves, obviously, is actually quite difficult, as we know. So I'd say beyond just purely that basis.
I mean, certainly a scoping report would be suitable, I think.
Yeah, I think it's worth doing. There's also, I think it's 313 and 314, inviting the monitoring officer to take council's opinion on a couple of issues. Would anyone have any comments on that?
I mean, can I just come in on the first one, which is the issue about the distinction between acting as a council? I mean, I think that seems now to be fairly clear that if you are, as an elected member, posting on social media in your personal capacity and you're talking about political issues, you can't make the case that you're not talking about the council. I mean, it just is nonsense, quite frankly. And I don't think anyone would. I'm not sure we need a QC's advice on that one, and unless we want to look at other cases that may well help. Well, the other one, I think I would think it might be worthwhile doing. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor
Thank you,
Gardner.
Chair. On the point of council's advice, coming back to the point that Councillor Simpson made earlier, is LGR, assuming it does all go ahead, going to impact on how useful that advice is depending on how long it gets back? So how long is a piece of string?
Councillor, I think you're quite right. Yeah, it's always a question what you ask, isn't it? You know, if I ask what's the relevancy of the Ken Livingstone case in the the 21st century in the last 3 weeks, I'll get a sensible answer. But if I answer for any else, it might be redundant for the time we do LGR. I'm just really just on belt and braces, bottle out the idea of what the argument is. I was acting as a councillor on a Wednesday, and 3 minutes into the conversation, I was acting as a person. This constant twaddle I get about email addresses, Facebook pages, and the rest of it. I'm pretty sure that most people would accept our judgment as a cohort that you are acting as a councillor 90% of the time, 99% of the time, and the 1% you'd have to prove the contrary. So I'm sort of with you, but it's up to you. It's my budget, but I don't want to waste it. But I'm happy to take a lead.
Members, any more comments? Councillor Heaney?
Well, I mean, I take Peter's advice. If you think it will be helpful, then I'm not going to object.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful if Peter thinks it's helpful, then it's worth doing.
I just think it's very important that if we look down this, that it means that we don't ever have an opportunity to say something political, not as a councillor either. I think if we judge on each individual merit, that's what I'm trying to get at, which I think is fair, because otherwise, if you do genuinely say something about an issue and someone said, well, so I didn't make that political, even though it was on any person, or even if you're just out and about, I just kind of feel there needs to be at least some definition, but you should have to prove that, and it should be valid. I think that's the real definition, really.
Because certainly we could get the instance where an elected member is talking in their personal capacity about a national political issue that's not even in the scope of a council thing, and we have to make sure that they have the freedom to express that as a person and not as a councillor.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. Members, any other comments? Any questions? Councillor Heaney?
Just one comment. I mean, I think you can express a view on a national political issue which is not anything to do with your local authority, but you need to express that in a proper manner, i.e. not abusive, not derogatory, not in an offensive way. So if you are doing it in an offensive way, I think you put yourself at risk.
Any other questions or comments? No. In which case, members, it's recommended that the committee notes the report. We've considered whether any further action is required, and I think Peter knows what to do. And also, we place on record our thanks to the independent persons who have done a lot of work, especially recently. Absolutely. Is that agreed, members?
Yep, that's entirely sensible.
Yep. In that case, thank you, members. That concludes the business to be transacted today, and I close the meeting at 17:24.